When most people think about slavery, they think about chains, plantations, slave ships, and the unimaginable suffering endured by millions of people, and understandably so. But there's another question that receives far less attention, a question that may be just important. How did slavery survive for so long? Not how did it begin? How did it continue? Did it reproduce itself? How did a child inherit a condition it never chose? And how did that condition become something that could be passed from one generation to the next? Most people assume slavery continued because slave owners simply purchased more slaves. And while that certainly happened, it doesn't explain the whole story, because eventually something changed. Something that transformed slavery from a labor system into a hereditary system. A system where a child's future could be determined before they were born. A system where legal status became inherited. A system where bondage itself became a lineage. The key to understanding that transformation lives in one of the most important laws most Americans have never heard of. A law written in Colonial Virginia, a law with a Latin name, and a law whose consequences would echo for generations. To understand that law, we first need to understand the world that existed before it, because slavery didn't always function the way most people imagine. When people picture colonial America, they often imagine a fully developed slave society, white masters, black slaves, rigid racial categories, fixed social boundaries. But early Virginia was more complicated than that. That doesn't mean equality existed. It didn't. It doesn't mean racism didn't exist. It did. But the legal system was still evolving. The categories were still forming. The rules were still being written. Virginia had a problem. The colony needed labor. Tobacco was becoming enormously profitable, and profitable tobacco required workers, a lot of workers. The solution was a mixture of labor systems. They had indentured servants, apprentices, convicts, Africans. And while conditions varied dramatically, the legal boundaries that would later define American slavery had not yet fully hardened. In fact, some Africans completed their periods of service, acquired property, built farms, raised families, and became landowners. One of the most famous examples was Anthony Johnson. This was a man whose story reveals just how fluid early Virginia could sometimes be. This period represented a transition. Virginia's economy was growing, its population was growing, and its demand for labor was growing. The colony needed a way to make that labor force more stable, more predictable, and more permanent. Eventually, Virginia's leaders found a solution, a legal solution, one that would change slavery forever, one that would determine the future of generations yet unborn. And once that solution was adopted, slavery would never be the same again. The year was 1662, and the law was called Partus Sequitur Ventrem. In 1662, Virginia lawmakers adopted a legal principle that would permanently alter the future of slavery in America. The law was called Partus Sequitur Ventrem. It's a Latin phrase that most Americans have never heard of, but its meaning was surprisingly simple. Under this law, a child's legal status would follow the status of the mother. If the mother was free, the child was free. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. At first glance, this might seem like a technical legal detail, the kind of thing most people would never pay attention to, but the consequences were enormous because this law fundamentally changed the future of slavery. Before this point, slavery was often viewed primarily as the condition of an individual. After this law, slavery could become hereditary. A mother could pass her status to her children. Those children could pass it to theirs, and those children could pass it to the next generation, on and on and on. For the first time, slavery could reproduce itself automatically. No new legal action or decision required. No new court ruling required. No new purchase required. The system could now sustain itself through birth. And this is where the implications become even more disturbing. Because the law didn't ask who the father was, only who the mother was. Now imagine an enslaved woman gives birth. The father's free. What happens? Does the child inherit freedom? No. The child follows the condition of the mother. Now, imagine something even more troubling. The father is not just free, the father is wealthy, powerful, perhaps even the owner of the plantation itself. What happens then? Under Virginia law, the answer remained exactly the same. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, regardless of who the father was. Think about what this meant. A slave owner's own biological child could legally remain a slave, not because of the father's status, but because of the mother's. This is the moment when slavery stopped being merely a condition and became a lineage. Now, once you understand that, a new question emerges. Why? Why would lawmakers design a system this way? Why choose the mother instead of the father? Why create a rule that would shape generations? The answer had very little to do with morality and almost everything to do with incentives. When people first learn about Partus Sequitur Ventrem, the first reaction is often emotional, and understandably so. The consequences were enormous. Generations of people would be affected by a single legal principle. But if we want to understand history, we have to ask a different question. Not simply was it right, but why was it created? Because laws rarely emerge from nowhere. Most laws are created to solve a problem. And from the perspective of Colonial Virginia, there were several problems to solve. The colony's economy depended on labor. The more tobacco Virginia produced, the more wealth it generated. And that meant labor wasn't merely important, it was essential. The colony needed workers. It needed predictability. And perhaps most importantly, it needed stability. Imagine a different system. Imagine every child born in Virginia became the subject of a legal debate. Who was the father? Was the father free? Was the father obligated to provide support? Did the child inherit freedom? Did the child inherit property rights? Did the child have a claim to an estate? From the colony's perspective, those questions created uncertainty, and uncertainty creates conflict. Partus Sequitur Ventrem eliminated much of that uncertainty. The mother's condition determined the child's condition. Case closed. Simple, predictable, efficient, and extremely profitable. Because once slavery became hereditary, the labor force could grow naturally. Every birth increased the system's future workforce. Every generation reinforced the next. The institution no longer relied solely on importing labor. It could reproduce itself from within. Think about the scale of that change. Before this law, slavery primarily described a person's condition. After this law, slavery increasingly became an inherited status, a status passed through bloodlines, a status passed through generations. And this is what makes Partus Sequitur Ventrem so historically significant. The law did not merely govern individuals, it governed descendants, people who hadn't been born yet, people who would have never or would never participate in the decision, people who would inherit the consequences. In many ways, the law reveals one of history's most important lessons. Institutions are powerful, not because they control a single generation, but because they influence generations that follow. One reason Partus Sequitur Ventrem remains so important today is because it forces us to think about something larger than slavery, inheritance, lineage, and what societies choose to pass from one generation to the next. Every society has to answer a fundamental question. What gets inherited? What travels from parent to child? What survives beyond the lifespan of a single generation? Sometimes it's property, sometimes it's wealth, sometimes it's citizenship, sometimes it's a family's name, sometimes it's language, sometimes it's culture, sometimes it's identity itself. Most of us inherit a lot more than we realize. We inherit traditions, beliefs, stories, customs, expectations, opportunities, and sometimes burdens. And this is where Partus Sequitur Ventrem becomes so revealing because it demonstrates the incredible power of inheritance. One legal decision, one rule, one definition, and suddenly an entire social status could move from one generation to the next. The law wasn't just regulating individuals, it was regulating descendants, people who hadn't been born yet, people who would inherit the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. And once a society decides what can be inherited, that decision often outlives the people who created it, sometimes by decades, sometimes by centuries. This is one reason that history matters, because many of the realities we experience today began as decisions made long ago. Decisions that seemed practical at the time, temporary at the time, useful at the time, yet whose consequences continued long after their creators were gone. And that raises an interesting question. If societies possess the power to pass status from one generation to the next, what determines how they choose to do it? Why do some societies trace lineage through fathers? Why do others trace lineage through mothers? And why did Virginia make the choice that it did? Because here's the irony. Many societies throughout history traced inheritance through fathers, family names, property rights, authority, lineage. Yet when Virginia decided how slavery would be inherited, it chose the mother, not because it wanted to empower women, not because it wanted to elevate mothers, but because it served the interests of the system. One of the most fascinating aspects of Partus Sequitur Ventrem is the question it forces us to ask. Why the mother? Why not the father? For much of human history, many societies trace important things through the father. The family names, prosperity, inheritance, lineage, legacy. The paternal line often serves as the foundation for determining status. Yet when Virginia decided how slavery would be inherited, it chose a different path. Not the father, but the mother. And that decision would shape the lives of countless people for generations. Now, it's important to understand what was happening there. Virginia wasn't making a philosophical statement about motherhood. It wasn't promoting women's rights. It wasn't attempting to elevate the maternal authority. The colony was solving a practical problem. The question wasn't, what is fair? The question was, what is useful? What creates certainty? What protects property? What protects the labor supply? What reduces legal disputes? From the perspective of the colonial government, maternal inheritance solved several problems simultaneously. The identity of the mother was obvious. The identity of the father could be disputed. The mother's status was visible. The father's obligations could become contested. By tying status to the mother, Virginia created a system that was simpler to administer, simple to enforce, and extremely effective at preserving the institution. And this reveals something important about institutions. Institutions often make decisions based on functionality, not morality, not justice, not fairness, functionality. History's filled with examples of systems creating rules that serve the system itself. Rules that increase stability, rules that increase efficiency, rules that protect existing incentives. And sometimes those rules continue producing consequences long after people who created them are gone. And few laws demonstrate this better than this one. Because with a single legal principle, Virginia transformed slavery from something a person experienced into something a person or family could inherit. One of the reasons Partus Sequitur Ventrem is so fascinating because it reveals the power of inheritance, not simply biological inheritance, but social inheritance, cultural inheritance, institutional inheritance. Every generation inherits something. Sometimes it's wealth, sometimes it's debt, sometimes it's opportunity, sometimes it's hardship, sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes it's ignorance, sometimes it's a legacy, carefully built over decades. And sometimes it's a burden created long before we arrived. Most of the time, we don't choose what we inherit. We simply arrive and discover it waiting for us: a language, a culture, a family, a nation, a set of assumptions about the world. And this is where history becomes personal, because inheritance is not limited to property. Ideas are inherited, beliefs are inherited, stories are inherited, fears are inherited, habits are inherited, even identities can be inherited. Long after the law disappears, its effects can remain. Long after an institution changes, its influence can remain. Long after a generation is gone, the consequences of its decisions can remain. This is one of the reasons studying history matters. Not things that you heard someone say, but what you studied for yourself, because history is not merely the study of the past. History is the study of how the past reaches into the present. And when we look at this law, Partus Sequitur Ventrem, we see one of the clearest examples imaginable. A single legal principle, a single decision, a single rule, and its effects continued across generations. So here's a question. If societies possess the power to pass status from one generation to the next, what else can they pass down? What ideas are we inheriting? What assumptions are we inheriting? What stories are we inheriting? And maybe more importantly, which of those things should continue and which should end with us? Because every generation becomes the ancestor of another. And whether we realize it or not, we're always passing something forward. And that may be the most important lesson, not simply that slavery became hereditary, but that societies possess extraordinary power to determine what future generations inherit, for better or for worse. So ask yourself, what's been passed on to you that no longer serves you? And what are you passing forward as your legacy that might not serve your heirs, that might cause them more harm to good, that might be borderline useful to you today, but harm them in the future? Let me know in the comment section.